Hello, welcome to Books at the Bottom of the Stairs. My name's Lorene. I think if all went well with the editing, there are clips of the cats as they come down while I'm preparing to do this. And so the black cat is Taz and the calico cat is Missy, and they are both rescue cats in their senior years that we decided to adopt this summer. And I've got a lit candle behind me, so I don't know whether Taz and his grand bushy tail will pass by. So there could be mayhem afoot. We never know. Today I'm talking to you about a Canadian classic that is not very well known. It is Antoinette de Mirecourt, or Secret Marrying and Secret Sorrowing, written by Rosanna Leprohen. This book was written in 1864, and there's very little biographical information about Rosanna Leprohen. She was living in Montreal at around the time in the 1860s, where there was still very much a conflict between the French and the English. And it's a garrison town in those days. Quebec City is really just not, I don't think it's really Quebec City. It's more like Quebec Village. So what this book is, a romance novel, seemingly, in the garrison town of Montreal, where the British have just recently won the wars in France. Canada has come into. Canada is not Canada as such. It's a name place for us, but we're not an independent country at this point. So we are under British rule. The French in Quebec are definitely not happy about this, and there's a huge cultural clash going on between the British military. Makes sense if you don't like to be a conquered people, as well as the British interference in the judicial system of the French. And so there's all kinds of conflict between a British law or interpretation of a law, and what the people end up doing is getting their disputes settled by a curé, and that's usually someone who's a fairly powerful person in the community, but they generally are someone that the community trusts in order to settle these disputes in order to avoid the English. So that's just some background information. This is the time of very few roads, lots of sleighs in the winter, lots of fur coats and fur blankets, lots of fireplaces in people's apartments. What else? We've got the people who are sort of the upper echelons of society, to a large degree, have returned to France. Those that are left either are sort of clinging to their whatever positions they've had, or are trying to return to the positions that they've had, or they've got positions that they'd like to have, that generally speaking the British are looking after in a military overthrow. I don't know. Okay, so what we have is Antoinette de Mirecourt is a young girl. She's 17. She's living in the country with her father, and she has a cousin living in Montreal who's, a good 10 years older, who's a socialite. And Mrs. Dawley, we'll call her Mrs. D for simplicity. And she is definitely a frivolous, fairly thoughtless, shallow lady. She is there for the entertainment, she's there for the gossip, and she's there for the sort of machinations behind the scenes, and has very little sense of the consequences. She's a plotter, but she doesn't really give any thinking time to well, if I do this, then that will happen from a moral ethical side. She's more thinking about, well, if I invite this person and I seat them beside that person and introduce this topic of conversation, then, these people will become enraptured with each other. So it's irrelevant to her whether those two should be enraptured with each other. And this is what happens to Antoinette. She is put in front of Major... Oh my goodness, what was it? His name was, it was all over the place. Sternfield? And he is really a kindred spirit to Mrs. D. He's there for the fun. He's there for the social niceties. Now, Mrs. D is French. I should have said that at the beginning. And Major Sternhorn is English. And so I'm kind of surprised that Mrs. D's husband let her do as much socializing with the Brits as he lets her do. He's pretty oblivious to what's going on. He chooses to ignore all the socialization and so on in his family home. And so there are parties and soirees and salons and sleighing parties, and it just kind of goes on and on. Mrs. D asks Antoinette to join her in Montreal and to come out, to come out in society, as it were. And Antoinette is just the little country mouse, really. She has she's gone to these things in her own community, but they are nothing like the brilliance of the soirees that Mrs. D offers. In the country, you just need one party dress. In the Montreal, you need multiples and multiple outing dresses, and it just kind of goes on and on. This comes out of, I just looked it up, Carleton University Press and the Center for Editing Early Canadian Texts. So it's not an easily available book. You have to really work hard. So not many people know about this, and John Stockdale does do a very good introduction at the beginning, which contextualizes the book in its glory, if you like. And what he said is that Mrs. Leprohen is using her knowledge of life in Montreal, the imperial garrison town, and writing in the guise of a historical romance, a contemporary moral tale that addresses the challenges inherent in the cultural melange of mid-19th century Canada. So initially this book was not very well received by those in the 19th century, 20th century, you know, when they're going back and doing research, because it is a romance. It's a bit, the two main characters are fairly flighty. Antoinette is the mainest of the main characters, but Mrs. D and Sternfield are just so present. And Sternfield moves from being this gracious, charming fellow to being just a blight. Antoinette manages to keep her innocence through most of this, but she is coerced into a situation where she's asked to make vows of silence and swear it on the cross that her mother gave her at her mother's deathbed. So it has, not only is it the cross, but it is a deathbed gift. So her vow is just that much more important to her. And I think I'll do spoilers, because I really don't think too many of you are going to go out and fetch this book. So Mrs. D has manipulated Antoinette into a secret marriage with Sternfield. Why? I don't know. Like, it didn't make any sense, except that it amused Mrs. D. And Antoinette is initially thrilled by the notion. She's been swept off her feet. Sternfield seemingly is swept off his feet too, but what we don't know is he's done his research, and he knows that Antoinette will be an heiress one way or another. If her French father disowns her for having married an Englishman, he's okay with that because she gets her own inheritance, although it would be good to get Daddy's inheritance too. So Sternfield's decided that this marriage will be kept secret until Antoinette hits her 18th birthday, and at which point she definitely comes into her mother's inheritance. So Antoinette is realizing she's made a terrible mistake, just a terrible, terrible mistake. And as time goes by, Sternfield's real true colors come out, and even Mrs. D is beginning to think this is an irreparable situation, and she suggests divorce. And now in the background of all of this, you've got Daddy, and Daddy has his own ideas about who Antoinette is going to marry, and that's a local boy who has the adjoining farmland, and they've known Louis and Antoinette have known each other since childhood. It's a perfect match. Everybody likes each other. It's just that kind of country romance that, you know, everybody thinks is wonderful. So that's what Daddy insists on, unknowing knowing that there is already a marriage in place. Now, also, Antoinette has married in the Anglican Church, not in the Catholic Church. So she's got that guilt riding on her shoulder as well. So even if she can divorce Sternfield in the Anglican Church, which is possible, there is still the knowledge that she has committed to marriage vows and in the Catholic Church can never remarry. So she's kind of doomed if she do and doomed if she don't. Now, okay, so that's basically the plot. There's Louis eventually challenges Sternfield to a duel, and Louis manages to kill Sternfield. Yay, the bad guy's gone. And tertiarily, Colonel Evelyn, or Evelyn, of the British military has slowly fallen in love with Antoinette, and she has slowly fallen in love with him. They've had a couple of misadventures together, and she's been quite brave through them. It involves a turned over sleigh and just things like that. So she realizes what true love is, but she doesn't count herself available to Colonel Evelyn because of all the previous things I've just said. So there's that kind of non-blooming romance in the background, but with Sternfield out of the picture, now Louis is in trouble for murdering, so he's got to rush to France. But Colonel Evelyn saves the day and sweeps our heroine off her feet into a British marriage. That's the story. But what we get is really quite a really evocative depiction of what Montreal was like in those years, what it was like to be a recently conquered people, what it was like to be a socialite. The reason I'm reading this book is because I was reading Canadian women classic authors last year, and I thought, why don't I go back to the beginning, which would be this book or this book and similar like it. And there was not much edited by women or written by women in those days, so the selection is fairly small. What my research did show is that there are quite a lot of women who were writing articles for magazines and newspapers, but not novels. And if they wrote a novel, it was generally a frivolous novel, or as that was deemed to be the case by the men who were in the publishing houses. So this is the one that has survived the longest, and I think overall is probably one of the best written. But I mean, my one major quibble with this is that Antoinette hardly ever spoke. She occasionally would speak with her cousin Mrs. D, but most of the time she would blush or she would go pale, and then she would become crimson, and then she would blush, and then she would go pale. And I just thought, the amount of vascular activity in her cheeks was just outstanding. She didn't necessarily slump or put her hand to her head to her blah blah. She just kept coloring up like a chameleon. I just, honestly, is there nothing else that we can see to show us her innocence and her childishness and her forthrightness, but the color of her cheeks? I thought it was just silly, but I guess that's the kind of thing that was done in the 1860s. Just want to see what interested women writers at the time and compare it to what people were writing in the 50s and 60s. And I don't think I'll take this much past 1980. There's so many more women writers at that point. So I think I'm just gonna kind of go 1860 to 1960. Well, that's it for me today. I hope all your reading dreams and adventures continue to come true. And no cattails were burned in the making of this video. Bye-bye for now.